go with the acronym. So it's the Integrated Characterization of Energy Clouds, Atmospheric State, and Precipitation at Summit. Although that really does, you'll see in a minute, that really does capture what we tried to do with this project. But the news is that we were just funded this summer for an additional 2 years to add an additional component to ICECAPS called ACE, which stands for Aerosol Cloud Experiment. So you see the list of PIs here. Matt and I are on the call, but also Ralph Bernartz and Dave Turner are the other PIs. And the new ACE investigators from the University of Leeds are Ryan Neely, Ian Brooks, and Ben Murray. And I'll chat more about that in just a minute. So ICECAPS began in May 2010, kind of the spring, summer of 2010. We installed our instrumentation. And again, we were recently funded through the summer of 2020. This has been supported since 2009 by 4 grants, 3 grants through the NSF's Arctic Observing Network, and 1 kind of concurrent grant to do data analysis through the Arctic Natural Sciences. And I'm gonna just list the goals of these, of both ICECAPS and the ACE experiment, and just try to explain what the experiments are. And at the end, I'm going to kind of point you to our website that has a list of our publications. I'm not going to go into too much detail today about our research productivity, but I thought the purpose here was mainly to give an overview of what our goals are and what we're doing. But I can go into more detail if folks are interested. So really, the main goal was to measure the atmospheric thermodynamic state, cloud macrophysical and microphysical properties, and precipitation, really to answer some basic questions about conditions over Summit Station and over the Greenland ice sheet in particular. Really, how do clouds and precipitate seasonally? And what are the effects of clouds and atmospheric state on the surface energy budget? And how do clouds and atmospheric properties vary across the Arctic? And in particular, how do conditions vary between Barrow, Eureka, and Summit? Because Barrow and Eureka are what we call supersites in terms of atmospheric, of these types of measurements. So they're comparable sites to that at Summit. So this is a picture from a paper that Matt led that describes the project. So this was a paper from BAMS, and it shows the collection of instruments. And I just want to go through this very quickly. The primary instruments are the millimeter cloud radar. We have a couple of microwave radiometers. There are a couple of depolarization LIDARs. The spectral infrared interferometer, it's basically an infrared spectrometer, as well as our radiosonde program. So as part of ICECAPS, we instituted a two daily radiosonde program that began back in the summer of 2010. Now, what's important to note here is that this is a collection of both active and passive ground-based remote sensing equipment, and as well as some in situ measurements that are being made by the sondes. And this multi-sensor view of the atmosphere is really critical for understanding processes that are occurring in the atmosphere and processes that affect the surface energy budget of the Greenland ice sheet. Oh, I should also mention the SODAR here in the background that's actually on the surface. So the active instruments, the radar and the LIDAR, basically give us a lot of information about where clouds are located and about what they're composed of. And like at other locations in the Arctic, we have observed over Summit that there's a lot of liquid water clouds, supercooled liquid water clouds, and mixed phase clouds in addition to ice clouds that are occurring over these locations, and these supercooled water clouds have a very large impact on the surface. So the active instruments give us the locations and the phase of the clouds, and when you combine that with the infrared spectrometer, we're able to derive some microphysical properties such as the infrared optical depth, as well as the effective sizes of the particles under various assumptions. So that's basically what we have been doing for the past 8 years with ICECAPS. I'll get to the publications in just a minute, but let me also state what's going on now with the addition of the ACE experiment. This is an NSF-NERC collaboration between basically the original ICECAPS project and the University of Leeds. And I believe this may be the first NSF-NERC international collaboration through the Arctic program. And really, we've had a desire to look at cloud aerosol interactions for quite a long time, but our second AON grant that was funded was cut back a little bit, so we were unable to do this. So we were very excited to get this this collaborative funded. The University of Leeds is going to bring a lot of new instruments, some of which have already been installed. But really what we hope to do with this new experiment is to answer the questions of what is the temporal variation of aerosols over summit? Is cloud formation limited by the low aerosol concentrations that we know exist in that clean environment? What is the vertical variation of aerosols over summit? And are the aerosol concentrations at the surface, are they coupled or decoupled to those in the free atmosphere? Because we know a lot of times we're in severely inverted conditions, which are quite stable. Even under thin clouds, this can be true. How do aerosols affect the microphysical and macro physical cloud properties throughout the annual cycle? And what are the radiative effects, the direct and indirect effects of the aerosols on the surface energy budget of the Greenland ice sheet? So to answer those questions, we've deployed this year, Ryan Neely deployed some instruments to measure aerosols, a condensation particle counter, a clasp instrument, as well as an optical particle counter. We also did some testing with a drone where we attached a second optical particle counter to the drone and flew profiles from the surface up to 100 meters. We hope in the future to be able to profile to much higher levels, but this year we were just undergoing some testing primarily of the drone. I will mention that the optical particle counters, we did a comparison of those while I was at Summit in August, and they compared quite well. So we believe that the profiles, the preliminary profiles we got will be useful. But in addition to the deployment of the aerosol instrumentation, we plan to install some instrumentation for looking at ice nucleating particles next year. And this will basically be a filter sampler, which will pull air through a filter, and then there will be on-site testing of the filters by the technicians at Summit. So we feel like this will be an additional, a very important additional measurements to what the ACE component is able to do. In addition, Matt Shoup has really had a lot of contact with the YOP group, the Europolar Prediction Group. And I just wanted to mention that this was another point of the ACE, the ICECAPS-ACE project was to engage with YOP. So ICECAP data sets are, as we speak, being packaged for use by YOP modelers. And we are actively working with YOP to ensure that the observational and modeling data sets are able to be properly compared. And this is turning out to be not a trivial task, but we hope to make some progress here at the Arctic Science Workshop in 2019. So I'll point you to various archives. These data are archived at multiple places. It looks like I've got an error in my PowerPoint that I'll fix in the second link there. But to get a good quick look of the data, you should go to the third link here that is hosted by NOAA. But basically, the Arctic Data Center is storing the data. NOAA is storing the raw data that the experimenters are using, and then many of these products are comparable to those being stored or being acquired by the DOE ARM project. So we also archive the data at ARM if you're interested. So I just wanted to say that we have had, we published a lot. This project has been fairly successful. There's been over, I think 30 or 35 publications that have come out from this. And I just wanted to highlight some important things. There's been some high impact publications. Ralph Bernartz led a paper in Nature. Former student of mine, Chris Cox, led a paper that was published in Nature Comms. But we really initially focused on physical processes, and so the importance of the supercooled liquid water clouds, as well as the precipitation regimes that are experienced by the Greenland ice sheet and in particular summit. But now really we're expanding out to trying to use these measurements for model verification. And both Matt Shoup and Nate Miller have really led this more recent work, which has been looking at how models are using basically the summit data, the ICECAPS data, to look at how well models such as the CESM and the reanalyses are doing in simulating conditions over Greenland. And I'll just mention also, there's been a big educational component to ICECAPS. We've had many, many graduate students who have graduated, have gotten their theses and dissertations under this program. And in fact, we even have a publication of some of our outreach. So if you go to this link at ICECAPS, you'll see a lot more, you'll see a list of our publications, and you can go from there if you're interested. So I just leave it at that. We can go into more detail about some of the science if people are interested. I'm prepared to show you some slides that show some of the data, but just not sure what people want to hear today. So I think with that, I'll just open it up for any quick questions.
Thanks, Vaughn. Maybe we should go through the three presentations and then we can do questions and discussion.
Sounds good.
For all three at the end, if that works for everyone. Okay, so next we'll go to Brian.
Okay, here, just clicking on it to get this going. All right, can everyone hear me and see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about what NOAA, the Global Monitoring Division, is doing at Summit. As you just heard, the Physical Science Division of NOAA here in Boulder has had a long partnership as part of the ICECAPS project in doing work at Summit. So when I'm speaking for NOAA, I'm not talking for the ICECAPS stuff. I'm talking for GMD and all our long-term measurements. We are very intertwined, but I'll be talking about just one, not the other, just to be clear. So I think Vaughn beat me. I had a goal of having the least amount of slides, so I tried to sneak my name and title onto the first slide, so I'd have one less slide, but I still think he beat me, unfortunately, for the least amount of slides here. So what we have at Summit, I'm going to quickly give you the rundown of what our current science is. I'm going to show you a couple data plots of things that we've seen that's interesting and why we look at Summit different from the other Arctic research sites, a couple papers, and where we get our data from. So our current Summit science is mostly the flask measurements. We're filling flasks for our carbon cycle research group and for our halocarbons group. Between the two, we're upward of about 65 species that we're measuring out of each of those bottles of air that are then brought back to Boulder for analysis, both here at the lab at NOAA and then over at INSTAR, which is our collaboration with the University of Colorado. We have an aerosol in situ measurement suite that was a collaboration with Mike Bergen's group. And we have surface ozone measured at the site. And here on the right, you can see CO2. This is a plot I just pulled off the website yesterday. and you can see our measurements going up since the late 90s. You can see when station was staffed in the winters and not, and then it was continuous from 2003, 2004 on. You see a nice record we're getting from Summit. So in addition to that science, we also have two other things that we provide for Summit. First is the station meteorology, where our MET suite is modeled after other baseline observatories, just a little bit simplified. We don't have as many heights of measurements, but we have the basic measurements required for flight operations. We calibrate and provide that data to the science community. We try to get the data in real time for flight decision support. We can feed it to station for north wind operations in real time, so folks can look at what the winds are doing. Is it a good time to operate or not? And then we're archiving all that data and trying to get that information out to public, because it's amazing how much as we want to think that the public wants to know our science, they want to see pictures of our sites and know what the weather's like there. Those are our number one and number two hits on our GMD website, are the photo archives of our stations and the weather at them. And then we also serve as a calibration clearinghouse in collaboration with Connie Steffen and the Swiss instrumentation for the radiation equipment that's up there. We did have our own radiation suite. We had a ozone sonde, multi-year record, and we had an in situ gas chromatograph. All of those instrument suites require a lot of just time and a lot of cargo to keep operational. So in 2017, we decided that we could answer our scientific questions with our flash measurements and with the suite of instrumentation we still have running today. And now we were going to reduce our presence. We're going to not fund to have a NOAA station science technician at the site and not be moving all of the cargo, all these flasks, all these cylinders that were needed for doing balloon operations in the gas chromatograph. So my talk's really going to be why do we like Summit? Why is Summit different from the other sites? We like to call it the altitude effect here. So this is looking at our halocarbon network, Steve Monska's network, and this is a slide he's put together for other presentations, and it shows how we compare our sites, our sea level sites versus our high altitude sites. So we do South Pole to Palmer Station, both in Antarctica. We do Mauna Loa, MLO, is 11,500 feet on the Big Island of Hawaii, to Kumakahi, which is the easternmost point, or at least it was until the volcanic eruptions might have made it not quite the most easternmost point of the Big Island. And then Summit Station we compare to Barrow and Alert. So what's really interesting is we do see these differences in almost all of our data sets. So on this one, for the moment, focus on the red and blue, which is looking at Barrow and Alert. And we see when we're looking at the marine boundary layer and how our measurements, this is bromoform specifically, we see enhancement and we see depletion events. We see a very different yearly cycle at sea level as we do compared to Summit in yellow and South Pole in green. And so that yellow and green is actually showing us probably what the actual northern and southern hemispheric means look like and how they're offset from one another. So Summit really does give us a very different picture being at the altitude it's at for the northern hemisphere Arctic region. We can also see this in methane and in carbon dioxide, where we see the sea level sites are higher in both in the monthly mean values year round. We do see for carbon dioxide, Barrow and Summit cross each other in the summer, but that's just due to the sink at land for the CO2. Here's another way to look at it, and this is actually, I think Chip's on the line talking about the above campaign. The Alaska aircraft profiles that we're showing data here from on the right are from Colm Sweeney and the aircraft, the above campaign, where we're showing from aircraft sampling in red at about 0.7 kilometers to the next profile at about 3 or so kilometers up. We see a very similar shift at those two altitudes when we compare that on the left to the ground station, Summit at 3.2 kilometers and Barrow and Alert being at sea level and in the marine boundary layer. So it just confirms, you know, our thinking that we look at our sites as giving us some of that vertical distribution just because of the location and the altitude they're at. We can get some very interesting information from that, and wanted to throw in the aircraft data really confirms that. So these plots specifically are carbonyl sulfide. We can shift gears. This is work of surface ozone that Audra McClure is actually presenting this week in Japan. So there's a lot to see here, but we're just going to focus on this dark green line, and it's shown that the total ozone at Summit is higher than every other Arctic station. And when we look over onto the right, I'm showing you the Barrow trend in long-term surface ozone, and we can see that the trend is slightly going up over the last 4 decades. I would have showed you Summit, but the record's a little shorter and not quite there for doing that kind of trend look. But we're seeing the same sort of thing at Summit. We're seeing an increase at Summit Station. And most likely, this is pretty interesting, it's related to the halogen chemistry, right? We have more open water at sea level at all of these Arctic stations that are right on the coast. More open water, we don't have as many of these leads in the sea ice that we used to have with bromine coming out. That bromine would come out and destroy ozone. So on the right, we're looking at for the month of May, the percent of hours that were under 10 parts per billion. It's assumed that when we're under 10 parts per billion, there's some sort of ozone depletion event happening, most likely bromine related. And you can see through the 70s and 80s, we're looking at anywhere from 20 to 50% of our time, we're in these under 10 ppb conditions. And look at just 2015, 16, 17, it's almost non-existent. And we're seeing that correlate in many different ways to just the amount of open water in Barrow. And we actually, Audra's work looked at this pan-Arctic, and it's pretty consistent across the Arctic. So similar, this was work that Lauren Schmeiser did, looking at how Summit Station is representative with all the other stations of the Arctic when we're looking at aerosol properties. So in this plot, we're going to ignore these bottom ones here, but we're going to look at here in the mustardy yellow is Summit. And you can see Summit is a very clean aerosol site, something that Vaughn was just mentioning. There's not a lot of aerosol particles at Summit. And this is important work because the models for aerosols in the Arctic are very much wrong in very many ways, but it shows there's a lot of diversity in the magnitude and variability of the scattering coefficients at Summit and across all the Arctic stations. So this was just recently published in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics this year. And then one other presentation. This is from Steve Motzka's work. He was published in Nature. This has gotten a lot of press in the last 2 months. We've seen an increase in the amount of CFC11. This is globally, so it includes the flasks that we're sampling at Summit Station. And this was quite a surprise. So you can see it's not quite turning over here in the long-term average, but it's flattened out. And when we look at the growth rate on this bottom panel, it's rate of change. These are the WMO scenarios where they thought if we stayed at this rate, we should be following number 1 and following number 2. And we're actually seeing that rate of CFC increasing the atmosphere. And it's pretty interesting. And Steve really relies on, and he's the one that is probably our biggest proponent for why we need Summit in our network to really give us that altitude difference from all of the other Arctic sites. So with that, I'll just conclude with how do we find our data. We currently have a few, I think it's 83 data sets available online that are all coming from Summit Station. So this is the web link for our main data portal where you can click on Summit here on the map, and it'll pop you up on the right where you can pick any of these parameters. If you clicked on halocarbons and time series, you'd pop up this F11 time series that I did yesterday from the website. You can also download the data from there. You can also click on data files, which will bring you to our FTP data archive where you can sort it in multiple different ways to get to the data file you want. And of course, last but not least, reach out to myself if you can't find what you need, and we'll definitely point you and connect you to their PI and the data set you're looking for. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That's really interesting. So we have one more presentation before we go into discussion, and that's from Christine.
Okay. So I'll see if, I cannot share screen. Okay, let's try it one more time. Super. Can you all see that? No, I can't see you nodding, but.
Yes, we can see it. It looks good.
So today I'm actually representing Detlev. All of our co-PIs have been traveling this week. And so Detlev, myself, Louisa Emmons from NCAR, Maria Valmartin from the University of Sheffield, and a postdoctoral researcher, Helene Angot, were just awarded an AON award to look at atmospheric tracers of different air pollutant sources and atmospheric chemistry at Summit. And this is the second AON award that Detlev has led. The first one went from about 2011 through 2017 to run a gas chromatograph at Summit so that we could look at a whole host of different volatile organic compounds. NASA provided funding for operations and not analysis, but at least to keep the instruments going through 2018. And then this new project will get started as soon as possible in early April, I think, of next year. This is really complementary to the work that Brian just showed, the VOC flask measurements from NOAA. Detlev has question marks in this slide, but Brian just commented on that work there. But what's really outstanding is this, again, is a nice long-term record of specific volatile organic compounds that we can use to look at atmospheric chemistry and identify potential sources from Summit. The general science questions associated with this particular project are: what are the occurrences, source regions, emissions trends, and atmospheric and climatic impacts and feedbacks of wildfires in Greenland and the wider Arctic? The reason why myself and Maria and Louisa are associated with this project is because we're experts in understanding wildfire activity, emissions, and chemistry, and we really want to look at how that particular source of air pollution is impacting the cleaner, pristine atmosphere in the Arctic. And Summit is an awesome place to take measurements to help complement the modeling efforts. And then the second science question is: what are the trends of methane and non-methane hydrocarbons in the Arctic, and how are they related to emissions and changes within and outside of the Arctic? And so just an example, there was a wildfire in Summit, 2017. And what was really exciting was that the plumes were actually measured at Summit. So we have particular evidence that we can look at wildfire plumes from this stationary source. The project goals, there's some that have to do with actual instrumentation and measurements. We're going to continue the operation of an automated GC system at Summit for continuous methane and non-methane hydrocarbon measurements, increasing the time resolution. 3 new volatile organic compounds are added to that monitoring. That also includes acetonitrile, which is a tracer of wildfire smoke. And then operation of a Picaro analyzer for monitoring methane, CO, and CO2. And again, this is really complementary to the flask measurements. This adds a high time resolution measurement to complement the flask measurements. There's a data processing and analysis component, providing real-time publishing of the data for anyone to use and to provide public archives. And then we will be looking at trends in these particular compounds. Because we have such a long record, we can look at analysis of occurrence for pollution transport, and then look at fire tracer relationships to help us better constrain emission estimates. From these data and other work that we're doing that's really complementary and leveraged, we will be updating emission estimates, particularly for northern or higher latitudes, and make that available for chemical and climate model applications. And we will be using some modeling tools to look at extent of fire impacts, source regions, seasonality trends, climate feedbacks from wildfires at northern latitudes. This is just a figure of the site and the instrumentation that Detlev has currently. Unfortunately, I've never been there, but many of you have. So yes, maybe someday I'll get there. And I wanted to show just a couple slides of the measurements that have been taken so far. This is in situ ethane. So you can see there's a lot of seasonality. There's a lot of variation from year to year. And sorry, I skipped my notes. And the seasonal decline changes from year to year too. So, and we really don't understand what's causing that differences. And so additional measurements and then complementary measurements of other compounds would be really helpful. What's really, this is a picture showing the measurements, the high time resolution measurements of ethane compared to the flask measurements. You'll see here, they compare exceptionally well. It's awesome. However, if you look more closely, you can see that the real-time ethane really gets this, this variability and really can identify transport events. So we can look at specific events where particular sources are impacting the site. And this is just an example of a footprint analysis showing where the air masses came from based on the measurements. You know, this work already has been really impactful, looking at ethane trends and using them to identify changes of sources. For example, ethane from oil and gas activities in the U.S. We think that this decline in ethane is a result of the change in oil and gas rig counts, and it's directly tied to the economics. And again, you know, looking at changes in methane and seasonality change in methane. And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that because I know time is tight. But I've included a bunch, or Detlef has included a bunch of results looking at different trains in these trace gases. He's gotten some really great publications out of the records so far, looking at these trends and tying them back to specific emission sources. And then it looks like there's some new trends that are happening, in particular with methane. And so getting this longer record moving forward will be really helpful. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Christine. So before we go into discussion, I'll just share with the group why I saved all of the questions and discussion until last. And as Meredith and the rest of the IARPIC staff have been bringing me on board as a co-lead, and helping me to learn the process, they told me how one of my former NSF colleagues described these short IARPIC 1-hour sessions, and that was Bill Wiseman, and he described these as miniature workshops that he didn't have to fund. And I thought that was a really clever way of looking at these. So that's why I pushed us to save the questions and discussion until after the 3 presentations were over, so that we sort of have a broader view of some of the research that's happening at Summit. So with that in mind, I invite people to ask questions and talk about some of the slides that we've seen here. Does anybody have anything they want to start with?
Well, this is Vaughn. I think that it was great to hear Detlef's new project, because I think, you know, we're certainly on the lookout for events that cause large amounts of aerosols to come over Greenland ice sheet. So I think it'll be really nice to have these complementary measurements being made by your group on the actual chemical changes as well.
Yeah, and actually I was excited to hear about your project as well. I wasn't aware of it, and I'm coming into this as an outsider. So actually I'm kind of glad that Detlef couldn't make it today, because I had no idea. So now I look forward to collaborating moving forward.
Definitely.
Well, we're sorry he couldn't be here, but we're happy you're here, Christine. That's great. Other questions or comments?
It's really nice to see all this activity going on at Summit. It is a unique view, and I was impressed to see that Detlef's able to look at these ethane ratios or slopes, changes in slopes, and say something about emissions in the U.S. and the combination of the LIDAR measuring aerosols and seeing layers of aerosols would be a great way to track those biomass burning plumes. So getting the boundary layer height, seeing above the boundary layer, the radius ones. My only complaint is I think we really do need those ozone sondes back, but I know funding is tight.
I'll just jump in real quick, Christine. We are able to do, I have a student right now who's doing retrievals of ozone, like stratospheric ozone from my FTIR. So we've been using the long coincident ozone sondes by NOAA to kind of train the retrieval algorithm. So as long as the infrared spectrometer is there, we will be able to see actually very high time resolution changes in ozone.
I just had a question. Is anyone doing any complementary modeling, regional or even hemispheric modeling in support of their projects?
So this is Matt Shoup. We have done some. So Vaughn mentioned that for ICECAPS, we actually had an ANS funded project. So that was actually to do some good science with our work. And as part of that, we did some regional modeling. And we're largely interested in the clouds, but we did actually a lot of transport modeling as well, because we're interested in the sources of the air masses and how those come together to influence the clouds. And it actually found some really interesting interactions vertically between upper level transport and kind of boundary layer, lower level transport, and how those interact from the kind of cloud microphysical perspective and the movement of moisture. Of course, aerosols would be very interesting there, and we're still at a pretty coarse approach to aerosols in our model. But I think that there's a lot of possibility there. So we've certainly done that. There are some other groups, so we've had some interest from other people that are interested in using our data. So there's some of that going on, but I think there's a room for a lot more.
Yeah, this is Brian with GMD, and I would agree. There's room for a lot more. We've done some. The aerosol work I showed was because we've been interacting with a couple of groups on trying to improve the aerosol models across the Arctic. So we've had a little bit of collaboration there. We also we have the carbon tracker product that all of our FLASH data does feed into for modeling the gases for both carbon and methane. But yeah, there's a lot more opportunity there.
So just one quick comment about there is a model that's optimized apparently for the Arctic polar wharf that Dave Bromwich's group has worked on for years, and Matt and others at CU and NOAA have used that model to look at various time periods during ice caps. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done on polar wharf. There's a recent paper that I'm involved in using the NICE data that shows that there's still a lot of deficiencies in that model, even just for kind of basic meteorology and surface energy balance.
Also, for what it's worth, we've been using FlexPart, which is fairly well validated for the Arctic, I think, compared to other models, particularly for combustion aerosols like biomass burning. And we've done some validation with aircraft and also with satellite. I know it's not perfect to compare LiDAR to black carbon. It's not the same thing, but you can at least see whether or not the black carbon is present in the same place as an aerosol layer. And it does pretty well, actually. So we've been kind of pleased with the FlexPart model.
Yeah, just a little bit. We'll be using like a coarser scale. I mean, probably CESM and nesting down. So it would be great to coordinate with whoever else is. I mean, I would love to coordinate with someone with the FlexPart and even the polar wharf, just to see if we're getting any kind of boundary layer and clouds anywhere near correct. So
I think André Stoll is really the expert on FlexPart. We're kind of collaborating with him, so I'm not an expert in it myself, but he's a good person to contact.
Also, I also know that John Burkhardt at the University of Oslo I think was recently funded to do a bunch of FlexPart trajectories and analyses over Summit. So he might be a person to contact as well.
Yeah, we do a lot of studies with WRF and polar WRF here in Alaska, and also studied the impact of some wildfire emissions on the Arctic for the 2004 wildfires. The problem with WRF and polar WRF is we have strong surface inversions. We need to tweak the model quite a bit to be somehow realistically. That's a main issue there. But to my knowledge, there are no models which do really great with those inversions. So there's a lot of research needed.
So I'll put on my program manager hat and ask the question, do I hear the beginnings of synthesis talks or synthesis collaborations?
Sure.
Maybe a special session at AGU a year from now.
I personally like doing aerosol cloud interaction research. We need better aerosol models. Like we can't observe aerosols over the Arctic under thick clouds right now. And so we rely completely on, if we're looking at least on a satellite level, a regional wide scale, we require aerosol models, and they have to be, yeah, it would be great if they're better than they are. And at least if they're better validated than they are, but also hopefully if they're good. So.
Jen, maybe we need an actual funded workshop.
Maybe.
I do think it would be useful for the community to have more opportunity for synthesis. So I know we have occasional GEOSummit meetings where we have all the summit investigators come together at AGU or elsewhere. A lot of those are kind of at the fringes, but having a little more dedicated focus on synthesis would be useful, I think. The community is kind of coming together. I wouldn't say synthesis, but there's quite a dialogue about clouds and their role in melt and surface right now going on internationally with regard to Greenland. So that's another area where we could really, with some more coordination, could actually do some good synthesis there to kind of come to some broader agreements and move forward.
So I think this is the beginning of a really good discussion. I think there's been a lot of really good comments, ideas, and it's nice to hear people talking about excitement for complementary work. So I think we'll have a couple of upcoming opportunities to talk some more, maybe at AGU, and if there's a GEOSummit meeting this fall or this winter, I mean. So, you know, somebody would need to take the lead on that, but it does sound like that could be a logical next step for some of this work that's occurring at Summit. So we're at the end of our hour, and I don't know if anybody has any additional comments, or Meredith, if there's anything else we need to cover.
No, I think that's everything. Great job, great first meeting.
Thanks. It was a really good discussion. So thanks for everyone for stepping up and those who gave presentations today too to start this good discussion. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. There will be a recording available in the next couple of weeks of this discussion if you want to go back and listen.
Okay, and so the last thing is just that the next meeting for the Atmosphere Collaboration